We've got Eddie there, Eddie the very well-educated terrier with David Rushton. Welcome, Eddie. Lovely to see you as well. I'm sure Eddie will learn a great deal from this evening's meeting. So it's now my real pleasure to introduce Professor J.R. Watson, who is a distinguished academic of English literature, and particularly in the areas of Romantic and Victorian studies. He's published particularly on Browning, on Wordsworth, and long before I even knew he was a real person, as it were, I used to read his work as an undergraduate. So it was a real thrill, actually, when I began to get to know him in person in Durham many years ago. Dick is also one of the leading scholars in the world of hymnody, and he's very fondly remembered by many of us as an outstanding university orator. I forget how many orations you gave, Dick, but it was a large number, I think over about 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. Now, for many of us here listening in, J.R. Watson is better known to us as Dick. He's also a fellow of St. Chad's College, and he's a great friend to many of us. And this evening, he's going to be talking to us about the 20th century poet, Philip Larkin. So, Dick, thank you very much for joining us on this Zoom little lecture. And it's now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. How do I get my face on?
You just talk.
That's all fine, Dick. You're good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming to listen to what I'm going to say. I knew Philip Larkin, not very well, but quite well. And I'm wearing this tie, which I don't wear very often because it belonged to him. It was given to me after Philip's death in 1985 by Monica Jones, who was a much loved colleague of mine and Philip's constant woman friend over many years. His poetry has stood the test of time and survived remarkably well in spite of the publications of his letters and some of the shocking right-wing opinions of his later years. What I find difficult to convey, however, is how much his poetry meant to those of us who read it in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He published 3 slim volumes in those years: The Less Deceived in 1955, The Whitsun Weddings in 1964, and High Windows in 1974. To some of us in those years, each seemed absolutely right for the world in which we lived. They said what we had thought but never found words to express. They illuminated the world in which we lived. As Pope says, it was like what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. What I want to concentrate on in this talk is the voice of the poems. By that I mean both the speaking voice and the voice understood in other ways. Larkin read his own poetry very beautifully. He had a voice which I once tried to locate by playing notes on a cello, and I found it to be a low G, the open G string on the cello, with a simultaneous pitch 1 octave higher. In a sentence like, "Man hands on misery to man," from This Be the Verse in High Windows, the voice goes down and becomes deep. On other occasions, it can be more neutral or lighter. So the first thing I want to do is to let us hear Larkin reading from one of his best-known poems, Church Going. What I think happens here is that the voice begins by being transposed upwards in a lighter key as he describes his arrival on a bicycle at a nondescript village church, and it's almost flippant to begin with. And the voice reflects that. It modulates into a reflection from a man who sees himself as a representative 20th century skeptic. Larkin has many personae in his poetry, and this one is a poem in which the speaker contemplates a world in which churches have fallen out of use, and even, as he says in one point, disbelief has gone. There are antiquarians who will go on looking for something, or people who remember Christmases, but he, who is at one point bored and uninformed, still recognizes there was something there. Now we are going to hear Larkin reading.
Church going. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats and stone and little books, sprawlings of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence, move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleaned or restored. Someone would know. I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Yah endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss, like this, wondering what to look for. Wondering, too, when churches fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into. If we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent-free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? Or, after dark, will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone? Pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one. Power of some sort or other will go on, in games, in riddles, seemingly at random. But superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was. One of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were? Some ruin bibber, randy for antique, or Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh? Or will he be my representative, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death, and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which, he once heard, was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round.
Thank you very much. This is I think, a very English.
Church going.
I'm sorry, we've had that. Can you get my face on the screen somehow?
You don't need your face on the screen.
We've got Jeremy and Alison, which is very nice, but I think I'm supposed to be visible.
Yes, you are
We've got
visible.
you visible.
You are
Yep.
visible to everybody
I'm visible
else.
to
Yes,
everybody
you are.
else.
Yes, yes.
Oh, I can't see myself, so that's all right. Good. This is, I think, a very English poem in that Larkin has hit upon something that can be felt anywhere in a village with an English church, especially and not a particularly interesting one. It also appears to be very sincere and authentic in its reactions. As I hope to show, the apparent honesty and simplicity is the result of much hard work. In this case, it proceeds from an initial caution, once I am sure there is nothing going on, that seems to regard a village church as a curiosity to be looked at rather scornfully. The place was not worth stopping for. He explores the decline of religion, wondering what will happen when churches fall completely out of use. Perhaps there will come places associated with superstition, and after that, ruins. Who will be the last to seek the place out? Antiquarians, Christmas addicts, or just someone like himself, bored, uninformed? At this point, the poem begins to change to its final vision. It was a place that held unspilt so long and equably what since is found. Larkin uses words really very interestingly. He does it again in the poem about his childhood, which he says was unspent. His child, the only where my childhood was unspent. And here it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these. And so it pleases him to stand in silence there, because in the final verse, the voice deepens into a new solemnity. A serious house on serious earth it is. The voice that he was exploring here, I think, is the voice that spoke for a country that he knew in all its different ways. It was his natural voice somehow. That was how he thought and felt and loved. He felt at home in it. That is why, when he was awarded the Shakespeare Prize by the city of Hamburg in 1976, he made something of a joke about going as far as Hamburg, sending copies of the proceedings to friends inscribed from Philip Marco Polo Larkin. More seriously, it became a kind of voice of England. That is why he was able to write Going, Going, about the destruction by neglect or profiteering of the country that he loved. And that will be England gone. The shadows, the meadows, the lanes, the guild halls, the carved choirs. There'll be books, it will linger on in galleries, but all that remains for us will be concrete and tires. And that's why he was photographed by Monica on the stone at Coldstream, marking the border between England and Scotland. He was photographed too in the clothes that he felt at home in, even for a holiday, sports jacket and flannels, ordinary, perhaps old-fashioned even then. His clothes were an expression of his selfhood, like his poetry. There is a famous moment, for those of you who know anything about Larkin, when he describes reading Thomas Hardy and realizing that he did not have to, quote, jerk myself up to write. Up to that point, his masters had been Auden and Yeats, whose mark can be seen throughout his first book, The North Ship of 1945. Now Hardy showed him how well a natural voice could work, how he could be at home in it, as he was in his holiday clothes. His voice was that of a man brought up in the Midlands who went to Oxford and who worked in libraries all his life. He spoke English unaffectedly and properly, using his voice to convey states of mind with remarkable accuracy. He used it too to establish his likes and dislikes. This is where the other meaning of voice comes in. The voice of Larkin is one that everywhere celebrates unassuming goodness and genuine feeling, and condemns pretentiousness, wickedness, and pride. We can find his likes and dislikes everywhere, as marked in the poems as Wordsworth's love of nature is in his. His likes include human relationships, especially compassionate ones, such as Maiden Name, in which he tells the girl how beautiful you were and neat and young, or love songs in age about the old lady. She kept her songs, they took so little space. And the bathers in the seaside poem, helping the old too, as they ought. And he liked simple things, such as looking at his girlfriend's photograph album, or old racehorses, or a tomb in the cathedral, the loveliness of spring. His dislikes included profiteering, the destruction of beauty, the neglect of animals or cruelty to them, people who are pushy or boring, and flash academics. We can see the last of these in Naturally the Foundation Will Bear Your Expenses, the title telling its own story of someone getting money from a charitable foundation. The setting is Remembrance Sunday. The speaker is someone who is off to India to give some lectures, off at someone else's expense. He despises the crowds who are gathering to remember the dead of 2 world wars. He's off in November to, quote, the sunshine of Bombay. That first verse is an example of everything Larkin disliked, the clever clogs, travelling around the world and making the most of his material. There is no doubt about where Larkin stands in relation to English life of the 50s, 60s and 70s. His voice in these matters is a comfort to all those who do not exploit others, do not cheat, and do not despise other people. It's as clear as a sermon. This brings me to another aspect of the voice with which I began. It is easy, in fact it is unavoidable, to pick up a characteristic Larkin poem and recognise in it an individual voice. Not only are the sentiments recognisable, the form is too. Not for Larkin, the pouring out of ideas and feelings on the page. Every poem is the product of careful work and a thoughtful use of metre and rhyme. If you're in any doubt about the craft and care that went into these poems, look at these drafts for what seems to be one of the simplest and loveliest of his poems, At Grass, about the old racehorses. To make 5 apparently effortless stanzas took 12 pages like this, 12 pages of compassion and love and remembrance of what the horses once were, the centre of attention, and it also contains, of course, a sense of their mortality, for these are horses in the evening of life. They relate to his poems about growing older and the increasing fear of death, which he called in Dockery and Son, the only end of age. The last few lines of that poem are bleak as they face the inevitable. Life is first boredom, then fear. Whether or not we use it, it goes, and leaves what something hidden from us chose, and age, and then the only end of age. Use life. Let it not just drift by. Whether or not we use it, it goes. The voice of Larkin has one characteristic technique. He will start in one place and end up in another, feeling like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, sadder and wiser. He does so, obviously, in the poem called Vers de Société, in which he refuses at the beginning an invitation to a party. No thanks, I do not want to go to your party. But as the second verse begins, funny how hard it is to be alone. So in the end, thank you, while of course I'll come. Church-going is another example. He often moves from a superficial first response to a more considered place. What he is doing, I think, is defining himself as a sympathetic observer of society, particularly English society. And one of his devices is to set himself up against an earlier voice, to reveal himself by contrast. Toads is another example. He dreams of a carefree life and finds it hard to have to put up with living a responsible one. And then in Toads Revisited, he reflects on the way in which work gets him through life. Give me your arm, old toad, help me down Cemetery Road. This relates, I think, to something that is elusive, but belongs to the voice too, in an almost imperceptible way. This is the way in which many of his poems have what I might call an under voice, a way of looking at life and expressing the feelings that correspond, I think, to some kind of under voice in our own minds and hearts. For although he is in many ways a commentator on the England that he knew, manifested in many various ways, there is throughout his poems a certain emotional consistency that may cause us to reflect that he is somehow on our wavelength, that across the perceptions of the dreariness of Mr. Bleeny's life, or the reflections on the Whitsun weddings, there is something consistent in the attitude to the humanity which we share. Not everyone will feel this, of course. Nobody can compel anyone else to like a particular poet, but there are poets whose work appeals to us, not just because they write well, or because they write about subjects that interest us, but because beneath all that, there is some kind of affinity with the way in which we ourselves live and think and feel. And personally, I feel this about Larkin. I suspect that something of this comes from his account and his interest in such things as how one lives a life, either married or single, and that life, in whatever way we choose, is lived in time, and that time is short. It ends for us all in death, and we leave behind either a life well lived or one like that of Mr. Bleeny. You will remember Mr. Bleeny has a landlady who welcomes his successor. This was Mr. Bleeny's room. He stayed the whole time he was at the Bodies till they moved him. The Bodies, of course, are short for a motor body factory, common in the Midlands in those days. Larkin was a good mimic, and many of his poems have voices in them in which he catches the moment perfectly. Think of the Whitsun weddings, in which one of the newlyweds on the train says, "I nearly died," or the "Now, dear child, what's wrong?" of the American evangelist in Faith Healing. In Mr. Bleeny, the poem moves from the landlady to the poet himself, who takes the room and takes Bleeny's place, as it were, and feels a despair that someone like Bleeny could live such a dreary life. with no proper home, no loved ones, just a hired box or room to live in. And of course, his successor is afraid that he might end up in the same way. Mr. Bleaney fills in the football pools each week. He went on plugging at the faraways and gets the landlady to buy a television set. This was 1964, remember. And he spends his year in the same old way. The Frinton folk who put him up for summer holidays, and Christmas at his sister's house in Stoke. This is the voice of an observer who ends the poem, I don't know, but he's also a poet who is part of the whole I don't know himself, because he is Mr. Bleaney's successor. That open-ended phrase, I don't know, suggests many things, but chiefly, I think, a kind of amazement mixed with despair, pondering how thousands and thousands of people can spend their lives in such a way. How we live measures our own nature, he writes. It is measured against the one great and inescapable fact that we are all going to die. And Larkin, of course, himself died very young at the age of 63. It's what I have called the undervoice of many of the poems, an undervoice that we can all recognize, and if we are honest, fear. It is this, I think, which underlies his last great poem, O Bard. As in some of his other poems, notably I Remember, and This Be the Verse, the title is a peg on which to hang something unexpected. An O Bard is a poem or a piece of music to welcome the dawn, sometimes associated with a lament by a lover that he or she has to part from a loved one. Larkin's poem shocks, I think, by its loneliness from the first line onwards. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Instead of the dawn, he wakes at 4 and is faced with nothing, for the dark is soundless and all he has are his thoughts about death. It is, he says, a whole day nearer now, and he cannot escape the dread of death. He meditates on its emptiness, the sure extinction of it, and on ways in which we try to escape that extinction. Religion used to try, that vast moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die. I always remember going to the memorial service in Westminster Abbey, where the Dean quoted those words and said, more or less, we think that he was wrong about that, and probably now he's realizing that, now he's in the other world. Or the free-thinking rationalism, which is specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel. And the poem ends, however, with the coming of dawn and the awakening of what Larkin calls the uncaring, intricate, rented world of work and life. It is unspoken, but the pain of it is that everything else goes on when you are not there. And life is so interesting, but perhaps it was just as well in the light of his last years of gloom, ill health, and depression. As Andrew Motion put it in a fine phrase, the world and Larkin had become incompatible. I'm going to conclude by reading O Bard, because I think it's such a wonderful poem. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there, unresting death. A whole day nearer now. making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and of being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare, not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused, nor wretchedly because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings and may never, but at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid no trick dispels. Religion used to try that vast moth-eaten musical brocade, created to pretend we never die, and specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel, not seeing that this is what we fear: no sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anaesthetic from which none come round. And so it stays just on the edge of vision, a small unfocused blur, a standing chill that slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen, this one will, and realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we are caught without people or drink. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different wind at than withstood. Slowly light strengthens and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe. What we know, have always known, know that we can't escape yet can't accept. One side will have to go. Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked up offices, and all the uncaring, intricate, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Dick, thank you very much. You probably can't hear us, but you can see some of us clapping, I hope.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. There'll now be a chance for conversation, for questions for the next 20 minutes or so. So I think if you have a question, if you want to unmute and say what you need to say. If it becomes too cacophonous, I will try and marshal that. If I can, I'm just looking to see if there's anyone. Yes, Jill, I think, has got a question. Do you want to unmute yourself, Jill? Jill, you need to unmute. You're still muted. There you go.
Just
wanted to ask about the uncaring, intricate, rented world. And it would seem that Larkin, at some level by choice, always lived in rented, I don't know, but a series of not particularly satisfactory lodgings. Was that the case when you were aware of him, Dick?
Yes, all his best poetry was written in a flat owned by the University of Hull in the top of a building in Pearson Park in Hull, until the university wanted to repossess it. And then they said to him, out, Mr. Larkin. And in 1974, I think it was, he bought a house in Newland Park, which is rather a beautiful little enclave off the Cottingham Road in Hull. except that his particular house was 1950s dreary. It really was a dreary house to live in. It was the first one he had ever owned. It was the first time he had to mow the lawn. And of course, there's that terrible moment in which he ran over the hedgehog with a mower, which horrified and terrified him. And Monica Jones went to live with him there when she got ill with shingles and was recovering, and in fact never left in the end. And it was a dreary house, but you're quite right. Everything else, everywhere else, he lived in what we might call temporary accommodation. Obviously, really quite happily. I think he wanted to live in somewhere where he didn't have the responsibility of ownership and all that went with it, like paying the rates on whatever else he had to do. I don't know. But I think he always, I think you're quite right, Gillian, that he always preferred to live in that kind of atmosphere. And that's where he wrote the poem about the horses, day after day, night after night. And somebody once said to him something like, how do you write your poems, Mr. Larkin? And he said, well, I have a notebook with a 2B pencil, and I write like that, up in that room in Pearson Park, night after night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Frankie, you have a question.
I have. I'm interested in his faith life and that wonderful beginning of the Arundel tomb where he talks about an almost instinct, almost true. And I'm wondering just whether there's any sort of development or change in his sense of the absence of God, if you like. I mean, it's a strong affirmation of what will remain of us is love. In that poem, and I'm just wondering if you can reflect a little bit more on his faith journey and
yes,
how he understands.
Yes. Can I just say something about that last line of an Arundel tomb? And I think it can be read like that. And in the memorial service in Westminster Abbey, Jill Bulkin read it with this ringing tone. What will survive of us is love. But Larkin says it's the almost instinct, and it's almost true, which leaves us, it's teasing us very much. It's like Keats in the Ode on a Grecian Urn. It teases us out of thought, I think, in that way. And of course, one of the things I think the absence of any kind of faith or interest in God led Larkin, was one of the factors. There were others, political life and various happenings in the England of the 1970s and 80s that he didn't like. And he became increasingly liverish and bad-tempered and gloomy and depressed and miserable, though not to his friends. I mean, we knew him during those years, and he was always courteous and friendly as well. I liked him very much, and with a remarkable sense of humour too. I remember Monica celebrated a 60th birthday, and he said, "What would you like to do?" And Monica, who came from these parts, from Weardale, from somewhere like St. John's in Weardale, Monica said, "I'd like to go to Durham." And Philip wrote to me and said, "Would that be all right?" And I said, yes, and we arranged for them to stay in the Royal County, I think it was. And Tom Craik, whom some of you will remember, and I arranged for a dinner in Collingwood College, which Tom was a member of. And we said, "Can we pay?" And he said, no, you can't pay. You will go down in history as the people who got a dinner out of Larkin. And that's the kind of humour that he possessed. And as I say, it was a very pleasant weekend that we spent with them. And they came to our house at the time. And he was a very good companion in all sorts of ways. But one of the problems of reading his letters and knowing about some of his opinions is that they really are not very attractive at all when he wrote them down. He was writing to certain friends, and that meant that he felt freer to express himself rather badly, I sometimes think. But I like to think that the poetry survives in spite of those last gloomy years. But I do think that last phrase that I quoted, and Andrew Motion's phrase about Larkin and the world have become incompatible, is very good, except on personal terms. I think he was very good still on personal terms. I hope that partly answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremy, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Unspent, unmuted, yes, and everything. Come on, Jeremy.
Right. Actually, I was lucky enough to study Larkin for A-level, and the first poem that you presented to us reminded me very much of the fact that as an outward cynic, he seems to be Larkin, and somebody who seems to be anti-religion. I don't know whether Ashley picked up on this, is that he seems to understand Christian ritual, though, and he seems to understand the perpetuity of belief, ritualistic belief. Because I remember when we were in Royal Ireland, when we used to travel outside Cork, and you could see these, what you would think are pagan shrines. There were holy wells and holy streams where people left votive offerings. They were all Roman Catholic, but they left votive offerings that took them right back to this pagan time, almost what we call the Celtic time, of leaving votive offerings in the hope that you could placate the gods, that they would make you well or rich or happy in love or whatever. And you really get that ritualistic sense of continuity reaching far back in time, which he puts into that poem so wonderfully, as if the church will, in ruin, revert back to that. So I was going to ask you, Dick, how much he understood of Christian ritual, do you think?
I would think quite a lot. He did ask at one point, when his mother died, he asked somebody, I think it was the chaplain of when he was in All Souls College, Oxford, as a fellow at the time, and he asked the chaplain to come to the chapel and sit with him. And he said, will you read Psalm 39, which was the psalm they read at Monica's funeral as well, the one that begins, I will keep my tongue as with a bridle when the wicked is before me. But it also has the lines about the time of man is short, and very apposite to Larkin. So yes, I think he was familiar with the rituals of others, as you might call them. And I think it's a very shrewd observation of yours, Alison, that you can pick this up from time to time. I think the formality of his verse probably owes something to the formality of liturgy, especially the formality of the older days in the Book of Common Prayer. But the kind of formality that exists in church going contrasts oddly with the kind of informality with which he apparently treats religion. What I think happens is that he just has these kind of dramatis personae that he uses, and he's picked this one to write that poem, and he will pick another one in another place. I mean, his use of different dramatis personae couldn't be more obvious, I think, and I maybe ought to have said more about that when I was talking about the voices, but I was trying to point out that his voice was so important. And I mean, there's a poem called something like Reading Habits, which ends, it's about someone who identifies himself with the coward in the novel and ends, books are a load of crap. And nobody imagines that the librarian of the University of Hull could possibly think that books are a load of crap. So, so that's how it seems to me. Thank you very much for that most interesting question.
I was going to add, Dick, that we spent quite a bit of time over the last 10 years in Hayden Bridge. And there was a hideaway there for Philip, wasn't there? I think.
Oh yes, yes. Well, there's an extraordinary story. The good people of Hayden Bridge discovered that I'd written a kind of memoir of Monica Jones for the Larkin magazine, and they wrote to me and said, "Could we use some bits of this?" And so I said, "Yes, by all means." We were delighted, and so Pauline and I got an invitation to come to the opening of this, and they put a plaque on the house where Monica lived, which was a nice little terraced house with a yard that gave onto the river on the South Tyne. And yes, we went along, and after various preliminaries, which I won't go into here, but after various preliminaries, somebody pulled the cord and this plaque was revealed. And it says something like, I can't remember the exact words, from 19-something to 19-something. This was the secret love nest of Philip Larkin and Monica Jones. And Monica, who really had a very strong sense of what was prim and proper, I think would have been horrified by this. But yes, Hayden Bridge meant a lot to Monica. She bought the house there because it was on the railway line and she had no car and could get from Leicester, where she worked, to Hayden Bridge without using a motor car. Philip often used to stay there, and other people did. I stayed there once, I remember. And it was a memorable experience, as everything was with Monica Jones.
Dick, if I could slip in a question here, I don't know if people doing English at school still read Larkin. Certainly, my generation very much came across Larkin at school. But you were talking early on about how astonishing it was for you to come to Larkin and what a modern voice he was. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that was like? And also how he was viewed in the academy initially.
Oh, I think the academy, as you rightly put it, embraced Larkin very quickly. Although at one point there was a sense that he was, I think somebody once was very rude about him, saying all he does is complain about the England of his time. Somebody, I think, had this awful phrase called the Willie wet the bed of English poetry, or something like that. And it was to counter that I wrote an article in, I think, 1974 called The Other Larkin, which my beloved colleague Stephen Regan picked out as a kind of turning point in Larkin studies. I'm sorry, I'm beginning to sound very immodest here, but it was something that I felt very strongly about. And what I said was that there's much more to Larkin than just a gloomy old grumpy commentator on English life. I was trying to make out that he was not interested in, but I think his work was paralleled by what I think of as the sacred and the profane that he held some things kind of sacred, like spring and trees beginning afresh. The show in Show Saturday, which again comes out of Hayden Bridge because Monica took him to Bellingham, which is just north of Hayden Bridge on that road that goes up to Jedburgh. And he then writes a poem called Show Saturday, which is all about how wonderful this show is, with vegetables and every kind of jam and animals and so on, what he calls a perfection of skills in there. And it's a poem that ends, let it always be there. And that's a very clear statement of what he believes, just as the one about the seaside by the sea ends about how he admired people who helping the old too, as they ought. That's one of the things I was trying to get across in the business of his likes and dislikes. And of course, he's horrified by people who buy animals for children just for Christmas, and the way in which, and he left quite a lot of money, I think, to animal refuges and things of that kind.
Thank you. Any other comments or observations or questions? Just trying to see if there are any other hands or...
Can I just say how nice it is to see some people I haven't seen for such a long time, like Liz Crossley and people of that kind.
Wonderful. David, are you asking a question, David? Are you just waving?
No, I will, if I may, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dick. I've really enjoyed that this evening. From the little that I know, and I've learnt a lot more tonight, I wonder if you could just comment on, I mean, I don't know how much scholarship is around his pseudonym, whether this, I think this was it in the earlier years, Brunette Coleman, and stuff that I've read, which I'm not sure how accurate some of this stuff is, and whether it was really reflective of his early days at Oxford. I've read a lot about that and about his exploration of who he was. I think some of that may be also connected with exploration of church, and I think I'm right in saying some of the high churches, some would call it antics, of some of the churches and college chapels of Oxford that I certainly knew when I was there. So I wonder whether there's a lot of within that question, some of it around his own sense of his own sexual identity, perhaps sexuality. There seemed to be a lot that I learned when I was at Oxford, and
yes,
how much is that steeped in just mystery, really?
Yes, I agree. I don't know very much about his time at Oxford. That's where he met Kingsley Amis, who I think wasn't a particularly good influence upon him. And he certainly was, I imagine, a pretty clever undergraduate at Oxford. But so it was during the war years, of course, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He wrote a poem which was never published in his lifetime, but is in Anthony Thwaites' edition, called which begins "City we shared without knowing," I think, about Oxford, and that's about Monica. But he didn't know Monica then. But I think you're quite right. Like a lot of people, he, as an undergraduate, was finding himself. He hadn't been in the army. I'm not quite sure why, but he was finding himself, I think, and associating with people that sometimes were a help and sometimes were not. And college chapels, of course, would not be, I think, to his liking particularly. I suspect his family wasn't particularly religious. Is that right? I think Sidney, his father, wasn't.
I think that's right.
Religion, and I don't think his mother was either. So he wouldn't have been encouraged from that point of view. But I don't know an awful lot about what his time was like, you know, in Oxford. But I think what you've diagnosed in those years is probably absolutely, you know, probably quite right. That if he did go to chapel and was put off by what you call antics, he would have certainly received the wrong kind of impression about what Anglicanism was. And I suppose St. John's was a pretty conservative college in that respect, where he was. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Wonderful. Good. Well, Dick, I think I'd just like to say thank you very much on behalf of all of us. It's really good to hear you on Larkin, someone who knew Larkin, who was friends with Monica, wearing the Larkin tie, which we can just glimpse on our screens in your little box there. Thank you very much. And just bringing out the voice. It was wonderful to hear him reading. I don't think I've ever heard Larkin actually reading before, and what a wonderfully sonorous voice he does have. And that's not what I would have expected somehow, just from reading on the page. So thank you for sharing that. And just for giving us a sense of this poet that is very familiar to many of us, probably less familiar to others, and just giving that a kind of context. And thank you for, I guess, being an important contributor in why so many of us do know Larkin and appreciate Larkin. Thank you for being the first to lead us in this little mini lecture series. It's been great to have you with us.
Can I just intervene to say thank you very much for having me?
And it's lovely to see so many people here. I think if we were all in the Williams Library where we normally would be, it would be pretty full. I'm sorry that we can't offer you our usual glass of wine afterwards, or a nice prospect of a formal dinner, but it's been lovely to share your company here. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Dick, to you. Thank you, Ashley, for helping with the technicalities of this. And we look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place, when the subject will be very different. It'll be on astronomy with Professor Martin Ward. So thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, especially Dick.
Thank you. Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Thank you all very much.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you, Dick.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Shall we leave?
Thank you so much.
You may leave, or you may, yes.
Thank you.
Stay around.
Whilst Jeremy where he had his haircut.
Me.
Do you really want to know the answer to that?
I did it today.
I ordered some clippers about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they arrived this afternoon.
And I've never done it before. I have never done it
My
before.
hair was so long.
Look,
I don't think I've had hair so long since
Done a wonderful job.
since the 70s.
my sister thinks she looks like Magwitch out of Great Expectations. I sent her a photograph. There you go.
Yeah.